Terrific. So welcome as folks are joining us for today. We are so delighted to have you with us. My name is Meredith Ferris, and I'm a facilitator for today's session on the nature-based solutions and USAID's climate change strategy. And so we're really glad to have you with us today. We have a terrific group, both from attendees and as well as our panelists today. We've got a great selection of folks to share what's happening in terms of nature-based solutions for mitigation and adaptation, as well as some examples in those areas. As you're joining us today, we'll invite you to use two tools, and we're going to get started momentarily. So you'll want to have these tools up and on your screen. So the first one is chat, which of course is a great place to share discussion points, to add in your own examples, to share links. Again, repeat or encourage any of the statements that the presenters have made. And so you can open up that chat and put in information. In fact, now if you want to share where you're joining from, that would be terrific. We'd love to see where our global audience is coming from today. So that's what you can use the chat for in terms of discussion. The other tool we're going to use today is called Q&A. And so that's the place where you can post questions throughout the webinar that our panelists will answer during our discussion session, as well as sometimes throughout the presentation. So again, if you've got questions today, that is a great place to post those questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Joey DeMarco to get us started with today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Joey DeMarco, and I work in the Climate Office here at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This is the third installment in our Climate Links webinar series on how USAID's new climate strategy connects with various topics, and you can find the previous two on finance and climate-smart agriculture at a link that I will put in the chat in just a little bit. There you'll also be able to find a recording of this webinar as soon as it's available once we wrap up today. And if we can move ahead to the next slide. So today we'll share with you how nature-based solutions show up throughout USAID's climate strategy and how two illustrative USAID activities are implementing nature-based solutions to address the climate crisis. You can see here our distinguished set of speakers for the day. We should have plenty of time for Q&A and hopefully even a bit of discussion at the end. So please do put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Ginny Kane from USAID Biodiversity to talk about where nature-based solutions fit into the USAID climate strategy. Ginny is a senior biodiversity and natural resources advisor in the biodiversity division of USAID. She provides technical leadership and support to USAID missions on nature-based solutions, climate-resilient biodiversity conservation, fisheries and food security, and promoting equity and inclusion in the environment sector at USAID. So Ginny, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Joey, and hello, everyone. This is wonderful to see so many people here, and I'm watching the numbers go up. So as Joey said, my name is Jenny Kane, and today I'll provide the overview of how USAID approached nature-based solutions in the climate strategy, including digging into what the strategic framework looks like. But first, it's really important to name here that the climate crisis is occurring concurrently with other global crises. So this includes accelerated loss of biodiversity, environmental degradation, worsening food and water insecurity, increasing violence and conflict, and the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. And addressing these crises in integrated ways is critical. And so nature-based solutions are a really important means to do this. Next slide. Nature-based solutions at USAID build on a long history of programming that we've had for protecting and managing ecosystems to reduce both greenhouse gas emissions and increase the resilience of vulnerable communities and ecosystems, among many other development goals, as so many of you know well. And so this includes sustainable landscapes programming, which implements nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation, biodiversity conservation programming, which provides benefits for both climate change mitigation and human adaptation to climate change, adaptation programming that employs nature-based solutions to improve climate resilience, as well as our humanitarian assistance portfolio, which also uses nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and recovery. Next slide. So now we're going to go into the strategic framework. This is what it looks like. The strategic framework articulates the climate strategy's vision of a resilient, prosperous, and equitable world with net zero emissions, and our goal of advancing equitable and ambitious actions to confront the climate crisis. These will be realized through strategic objectives that you can see circled here, and those are on targeted direct action, systems change, and then also doing our part at both USAID and our partner organizations. And before I get into where nature-based solutions show up here, I'd like to provide a couple definitions so that we're all on the same page. Next slide. So the climate strategy at AID uses the definition that nature-based solutions are actions to conserve, manage, and restore ecosystems. And that includes managed systems such as agricultural lands. And these address societal challenges effectively and adaptively. So here again, nature-based solutions are referring broadly to goals like climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as development goals like food and water security. So important to note, nature-based solutions can address a range of objectives. In turn, the term natural climate solutions specifically refers to just climate change mitigation in the USAID context. And so we use that to describe our sustainable landscapes programming, which you'll hear more about shortly. Next slide. Natural and managed ecosystems are the focus of one of our 6 ambitious high-level targets here. So you can see all of them together, noting that this one, USAID pledges to support the conservation, restoration, and improved management of 100 million hectares with a climate change mitigation benefit by 2030. So very ambitious and building on the existing programming that we have, and as well as doing new programming. Next slide. These are the foundational principles of the strategy. So nature-based solutions are one of them. And what this means in practice is that in addition to elevating the use of nature-based solutions in our dedicated climate programming, we're also building the capacity of staff to integrate nature-based solutions for climate into activities across sectors. And this includes doing things like developing sector programming guidance and also trainings. Recently, we had a staff training on improving development outcomes through the environment and natural resource management, and many USAID staff from across sectors and from across missions globally attended this. Next slide. Looking more specifically at the intermediate results, I'll name that nature-based solutions really shows up throughout all of these, but I'm going to touch on just a few. So under the first strategic objective, which you can see is targeted direct action, intermediate result 1.1 focuses on reducing emissions by catalyzing urgent mitigation from energy, land use, and other key sources. So that land use piece really is where some of the nature-based solutions work will show up. Next slide. And here the strategy also highlights that example activities might include things like conservation management and restoration of forests, mangroves, peatlands, and other high carbon ecosystems. It could also include things like protecting and supporting environmental and human rights defenders who advocate to preserve these critical carbon sequestering ecosystems, really critical work. Next slide. Moving on to the next intermediate result under the first objective. So 1.2 here focuses on supporting and scaling actions that build the climate resilience of people, places, ecosystems, and livelihoods that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate variability and change. So this inclusion of ecosystems here is a reflection of the strategy recognizing the ways in which climate change undermines the resilience of both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, which then in turn undermines the resilience of vulnerable populations who depend on these ecosystems for livelihoods and well-being. So relatedly, we're currently working on tools for climate resilient biodiversity program design. And this is to ensure the resilience of these ecosystems and also the continued provisioning of the ecosystem services that are foundational for development. Next slide. And within the strategy, and I hope all of you have a chance to look into it, you can see again, illustrative activities are provided. So under this building resilience IR, this could include things like supporting the conservation management of restoration of forests, mangroves, and peatlands, again, and other critical ecosystems to deliver adaptation benefits in addition to the mitigation and other co-benefits for people and biodiversity, and also strengthening natural resource management to manage and reduce climate risks and to build local capacity for resilience and resource sharing. Next slide. Importantly, the strategy recognizes throughout the importance of equity, inclusion, and human rights, and the critical role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in conserving ecosystems and sustainably managing natural resources. And really importantly, it calls for that emphasis in our program. And we've done a lot of that work and we can continue to do more. And this is reflected in foundational principles on locally led development and equity inclusion, which you can see circled here, as well as intermediate results on partnering with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and amplifying crucial voices that include women, youth, and other marginalized and underrepresented groups. Next slide. And then finally, the second strategic objective I'll name, it's catalyzing systemic change. This again includes how we use and manage nature, how we produce food, and how we organize our economies and financial systems. Nature-based solutions really need to be at the heart of these efforts to shift systems to lower emissions and more sustainable pathways, as they are the primary way we can address both biodiversity loss and climate change. So that was a really quick overview of the strategy and the framework. I'm happy to answer questions moving forward, and I do hope that you all dig into the document, take a look, and then let us know any questions or thoughts that you have. So I'll turn it back over to you, Joey.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Super helpful, I think, to see where nature-based solutions fit into the strategy just structurally, how we're sort of thinking about this, internally and with our partners, and see sort of how these nature-based solutions are critical for, climate mitigation as well as adaptation and our work to partner with local communities. So, with that, I think I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about, getting into the details of how nature-based solutions relate to both climate mitigation and adaptation goals. So to kick us off with that, I'm going to turn it over to Noel Gerwick. He is the Senior Climate and Land Advisor in USAID's Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure to talk a little bit about how nature-based solutions fit into the mitigation picture. Noel?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And you can move to the next slide, I think. So Jenny did a great job introducing this topic. I really appreciate that. And she started off talking about some vocabulary. Natural Climate Solutions is abbreviated NCS. Nature-based solutions is abbreviated NBS. And when we first started realizing that we were going to be using both of these phrases about a year ago, it just was kind of amusing. And I thought it would be nice to share that amusement with all of us today, because when you say them, NCS, NBS, they sound almost exactly the same. NBS is a much broader umbrella of a term. And if I were to mumble a little bit, you wouldn't know what I was saying. So I think we need a jingle and a little song about the NCS and NBS. And I'm going to invite everybody to, you don't have to do it on mic, but just sort of sing along and make up your own little song, your own little tune. And as Jenny also mentioned, sometimes you will hear the phrase sustainable landscapes. And we use that phrase effectively synonymously with natural climate solutions. So I hope everybody's kind of got it in their head now. You're the NCS and NBS, the NCS and NBS. And you can go to the next slide. I want to say a little bit about what natural climate solutions are and why we put so much resource and effort towards implementing them. There's really three ways we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the land, and the graphic on the right-hand side of this slide shows these. You can conserve it or protect it, you can restore it, you can manage it. And of course, there's different types of land, there's different ways we can conserve it and manage it and restore it. And I'm going to give you some examples, all of those shortly. It could be a grassland, it could be a forest, it could be a peatland, for example. You could manage the way that you're fertilizing your crops, the way that you're managing your timber plantation. You could protect using a payment for ecosystem services scheme, or trying to improve the rule of law and avoid illegal logging. Lots of options in each of these baskets. Thinking about this, the top right-hand side of the piece of this slide, where there's this number 11 gigatons. We often frame our work on natural climate solutions in the context of an analysis published in 2020, and it shows the potential for achieving climate change mitigation across the tropics in total and by country. And the finding of that study, which this graphic shows there, that 11 gigatons of CO2 per year number by 2030, that's the potential, that's what we could achieve in theory across the tropics by managing, conserving, and restoring land. So that the USAID climate strategy says that we are going to mitigate about 6 gigatons cumulatively by 2030, and the majority of that we expect to come from natural climate solutions. So that means our strategy says we're going to contribute about 10% through our USAID activities of what we could achieve all across the tropics. And that's the level of ambition that we're shooting for. And it's kind of what we keep in mind as we're thinking about what are our programs achieving? What could we do differently to achieve more? Next slide, please. This is a breakdown of that analysis I just mentioned by country. And what I want you to get from this slide is an awful lot of this potential for natural climate solutions comes from a small number of countries. Right? So 73% of the potential coming from 14 countries, and an awful lot of it coming from just Indonesia, which you're going to hear from shortly, and Brazil. We have programs in a number of these countries. We have programs in Vietnam, and Paraguay, and Madagascar, and Colombia, and Mexico. And there's some that we don't. It's always a little bit, we need to be thinking always about what are we achieving globally? Why are we working in the country where we're working? And we're also thinking about, in any particular country, what's a meaningful contribution in that country context as well? And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. I just wanted everybody to kind of get in their minds for a minute the landscapes we're actually talking about here. So the photo on the left, that's a high carbon tropical forest. That's one of these places we'd like to conserve. The photo on the right showing a deforestation front, showing the trends that we are bucking, that we are trying to reverse. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm going to just keep going because, oh, there we go. Thank you. Whoops, no, back to the peatlands. There must have been a lag in the system. I'm going to talk for a minute about peatlands and mangroves. So these are ecosystems. If you haven't ever had the pleasure to visit one of them, I hope you do someday. They're beautiful, beautiful places. And the photo on the top on the right is a mangrove. The photo on the bottom is a peatland. The story here really is in what you can't see in these photographs. There is a ton, more than a ton of carbon below the ground in these very carbon-rich soils in both of these ecosystems. They're kind of like the icebergs of natural climate solutions, where most of the story you can't see, it's below the surface. And a number of years ago, it was pretty clear that these ecosystems were not getting the attention that they needed and deserved as a way of achieving climate change mitigation through the land. And so we started a program, it's called SWAMP, Sustainable Wetlands Adaptation and Mitigation Program, to bring some attention to these ecosystems and to provide the underlying evidence base that our partner countries and that we as a global community needed in order to manage them better. A lot of our work through the SWAMP program now, which is a partnership between USAID, the US Forest Service, and the Center for International Forest Research, a lot of that effort goes towards helping countries to implement their NDCs, helping countries include peatlands and mangroves into their NDCs. And this is a centrally managed program, but it also has mission buy-ins. And this is a lot of how we work in DC, is we try to, in our natural climate solutions divisions, is we try to provide the kernel and the global evidence and capacity to fill in some gaps, and also make that available for field programs to use in a more robust way in individual countries. Next slide, please. If you are starting to work on sustainable landscapes, on natural climate solutions programming in a country, where do you start? And I've tried to give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the options. And I pointed out the global context for the potential and what some of the individual country potentials were, but I only gave you one number for each of those countries. So we encourage and support our work across the agency by doing these analyses. We call them sustainable landscapes opportunities analyses. And we do a deep dive into a country. Where in this country could you get the most impact? Is it from working on forest protection? Is it working in the east, in the south, in the north? Is it working on mangroves? Is it working on livestock? And so each of these includes one of these figures that is on the left of this slide to show that. And then often it'll go a little bit deeper in the figure on the right, showing the intersection of peat depth and roads, planned roads. So the roads are the threat. So you're going to need to manage the roads, but where do you need to manage the roads? Well, maybe you need to manage them most in places where you've got high concentrations of peat. In this case, in Papua New Guinea, a lot of the national potential lies in reducing the threat to peatlands. Another way that we have supported the field is we have developed a set of generalized theories of change. So we have one for payments for ecosystem services, for example. We have one for illegal logging. We have a number of these. And each of these says, if this is the pathway that you think you need to address, what are some ways to do that? So it gives you a place to start, and some of them are rather detailed. Next slide, please. I want to build on what I just said. There are lots of ways that you can slice and dice the approaches we use to implementing natural climate solutions, but this is one that we think is pretty good. Some things that you need to have in place in order to achieve success. There needs to be commitment, there needs to be capacity and planning. You need to have finance and markets and be creating economic opportunities to support and incentivize the kinds of behaviors and institutions that are going to contribute to this protection, management, and restoration. People need to have, and institutions need to have the land rights, that to implement these kind of strategies. You need to have data. You need to have the evidence, the kinds of things that swamp provides. Where are the peatlands? Where are the mangroves? How deep is the peat? How much is there? Where are the forests, and how much carbon is in these different forests? And everybody needs to be able to see that data and share it. Next slide, please. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into one analysis that we did. We know that agriculture drives land use change, the agriculture and food system is responsible for about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions overall. And it's quite challenging to work on sometimes. We know that the governance side of land use is a critical piece of that programming. So this is from a report we wrote called Agriculture's Footprint, and we said let's look at all of the different governance approaches and market approaches that one needs to bring to bear, one could bring to bear to keep agriculture from driving land use change. There isn't a magic formula for any country on this, but this at least gives you a place to start. And this report goes into each of these pathways and says, here's what some of the considerations are that you need to think about if you're going to be trying to address this challenge. Next slide, please. Just this and one more slide. And this is just an example of some of the kinds of work that we have supported that we think will be useful globally. This is on food loss and waste. I was talking just now about agriculture, how it drives land use change. One of the reasons agriculture drives land use change is because there's so much demand for products of agricultural. And a lot of those products get lost or wasted along the way. So what would happen if we could decrease that loss and waste? Maybe we'd need to produce less in the first place. But that's still kind of broad brush. What are the value chains where food loss and waste contributes the most to emissions? And how does that value regionally? This is a graphic from a report that addresses just exactly that question, and it breaks it down. This slide is for Latin America. And what you can see is that if a lot of these emissions from food loss and waste come from bovine meat, some of it comes from primary production, there's loss and waste there. Some of it comes from the distribution, and some of it comes at the consumer stage. There's not that much loss in the processing or the storage and handling stage. And this is a kind of evidence that we try to supply that we think will inform all of our thinking and work around this programming. And next slide. So said Conrad Cornelius O'Donnell Dodell, my very young friend who is learning to spell. And I won't take up time with the whole rhyme, but Conrad says that his alphabet starts with the letter called Yuz. It goes way beyond Z, which is where most of our alphabets end. And he said, you'll be sort of surprised what there is to be found once you go beyond Z and start poking around. And you might find the Yazamataz. Now, the Yazamataz looks pretty friendly here, but you don't really know what you're going to find when you start using the letter called Yuz. And I mentioned before, we have very ambitious target in our climate strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're probably not, it's going to be challenging for us to achieve that target if we don't take some risks along the way. And sometimes if we don't use the letter Yuz, and sometimes we might encounter a less friendly Yazamataz, and sometimes we might fail. But if we don't take these risks in our programs and do things that are a bit more innovative, it's going to be challenging to meet these targets, and it's going to be challenging to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which we need to meet for all kinds of reasons. So we are trying to model this as well in our work here. We have a couple of new programs. One is called the Forest Data Partnership. One is called the Business Case for Sustainable Landscape, for Collective Landscape Action, excuse me. And these are programs that of a sort that we haven't really planned or executed before. So I will leave you with the thought, use the YUS. And back to Joey.
Thanks so much, Noel. Really appreciate the overview, the sort of background information and definitions, the where to get started. I know that can always be difficult, and of course the enthusiasm and inspiring words at the end there. So with that, I think it would be useful to maybe get a little more in depth to see what this actually looks like on the ground. So I'm going to bring in one of our colleagues from the USAID mission in Indonesia, Amin Budiarjo, to talk about some of the work we're doing there. Amin? Amin, you are looks like still on mute if you're ready to chat. I mean, we're still not able to hear you. Maybe try coming off or coming back on mute and off, and if not, maybe we'll pop ahead and see if we can circle back later. But I'll give you another moment. I mean, you're sort of coming in and out. So maybe let's pause on this one and move ahead, and then we'll try and come back in a minute and see if there's a little bit of a better connection. Sorry about that. So with that, I'm going to move us ahead to hear a little bit about how nature-based solutions relate to our climate adaptation work and global climate adaptation goals. And for that, we have Emily Bondank from the USAID Center for Water Security, Sanitation, and Hygiene. Emily.
Thank you, Joey. So in addition to contributing to NCS or natural climate solutions and mitigation, why are nature-based solutions also critical for adaptation? That's what we'll be discussing now. So critically, they can help reduce the impacts of climate stressors like droughts, floods, and storms, while providing multiple development benefits and simultaneously maximizing ecosystem function and services. So nature-based solutions for adaptation play an important role in all of these sectors, including improving food security, water security, urban resilience, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian responses. And throughout all of those sectors, they are relevant in both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, as well as rural and urban contexts. So very relevant in terms of adaptation. In addition, and in particular, nature-based solutions for adaptation to climate change are often cheaper and easier to maintain than other adaptation options, making them really attractive. And they do not introduce additional risks like hard infrastructure might. An example would be using mangroves instead of sea walls to provide storm surge protection, as illustrated in our pictures on the slide. So now I'm going to discuss further how nature-based solutions for adaptation can be implemented, a little bit of detail on that for each of these development sectors that they contribute to. So next slide, please. All right, so climate stressors such as droughts and floods often magnify risks to food security, further threatening human health and economic productivity. And nature-based solutions can increase the resilience of food production and improve agricultural productivity in the following ways, as shown on the slide, and I'll share some examples for those. So interventions that strengthen food security can include planting shade trees to improve soil fertility and support pollinators, It can restore, or by restoring and managing watersheds to maintain water supply for irrigation. Rangeland management and intercropping can improve resistance to pest outbreaks. And for fishing communities in particular, protecting marine and freshwater habitats and strengthening marine tenure and fisheries management can help to ensure that fish stocks do not fall below their minimum viability levels and are more likely to withstand challenging climate conditions. Lastly, healthy ecosystems are also critical for the diversification of food sources, such as wild plants and indigenous crops, which can serve as safety nets in times of food shortages and provide reserves of genetic resources for future crop development. And on each of these kind of sectoral slides, I've included a USAID example. And so for food security, we have an example from Bangladesh where they used agroforestry, the restoration of wetlands, and improvements in the management of wild fisheries to improve local food security. Next slide, please. All right. So climate change also poses a challenge to water security by altering the timing, quantity, and quality of precipitation and water flows, leading to impacts on health, agriculture, and infrastructure. Nature-based solutions can be a cost-effective adaptation strategy to maintain and increase both the quantity and quality of water for all users in the river basins or watersheds, in ways such as recharging aquifers, maintaining humidity through evaporation, and improving water regulation. Additionally, some specific examples are forests, wetlands, grasslands, and riparian buffers all play important roles in filtering runoff, preventing erosion, and slowing sedimentation. Agroforestry and conservation agriculture can also reduce agricultural water demand, freeing up demand for water for other demands, and can help increase farmers' resilience during droughts. Next slide. Or actually, before I move, I'll share that we have two examples from USAID to share on this. One from Mongolia, where they enhance planning, management, and conservation of grazing lands, water resources, and forests. And one from Peru, where they improved green infrastructure for adaptation. Next slide, please. All right. So a growing body of research that climate change will also increase the frequency and some extreme weather events, such as droughts, typhoons, hurricanes, heavy precipitation, and heat waves. So a number of nature-based solutions can help communities become more resilient to events and reduce the risk of impacts. So, hope I'm getting a notice. My connection is unstable. I hope I'm okay. All right.
We can hear you great, Emily.
Okay, great. So specifically, some things that can help are the restoration of upland forests, degraded grasslands and rangelands, and coastal mangroves, which can reduce landslide risk and erosion from strong storms. The protection of coral reefs can provide a buffer against damaging waves. Riparian buffers can decrease flood risk. And restored ecosystems protect against drought conditions by absorbing water and recharging groundwater supplies. Additionally, green spaces and roofs and vegetated riparian buffers in urban areas mitigate extreme heat waves by decreasing the daytime temperatures, contributing to cooler water temperatures and improving physical and mental health. And lastly, restoring natural fire regimes to dry forests can reduce the impacts of uncontrolled wildfires. So lots of examples I'm sharing with you. And then for this sector, we are sharing an example from the Philippines, where they strengthen climate resilience by improving management of local ecosystems, particularly in watersheds. All right, and last slide for me is that coastal areas are highly vulnerable to climate stressors and maybe worth elevation in terms of thinking of nature-based solutions for them. They're vulnerable to sea level rise, increasing ocean temperatures and ocean acidification, and extreme weather events such as typhoons, drought, and coastal flooding. So nature-based solutions can help coastal populations adapt to adverse impacts of climate change in a number of ways, including, I think, as I mentioned before, the restoration of mangroves, coral reefs, and other natural systems to help attenuate the coastal erosion and storm surge. Additionally, healthy coastal ecosystems can act as barriers against extreme events. They can capture sediment and slow destructive wave energy for both urban and rural coastal communities. Conserving coastal ecosystems protect valuable nurseries as well for many marine species to maintain healthy stocks that are an important source of food for some communities. And improving fisheries management provides livelihood and food security benefits as well that improve communities' resilience to climate change. So now, after sharing all of those possible examples with you, I'm going to pass it over to Joey to introduce someone who will dive deep into one of our examples on nature-based solutions for adaptation. Thank you, and back to you, Joey.
Thank you so much, Emily. Very helpful, I think, to hear, the very many ways that, nature-based solutions can have benefits in the climate adaptation space, from resilience, risk management, even improving food security. That's really excellent. And so, but actually, before we move ahead to this example from the field, I do want to back up and see if we have a better connection with Amin, who is calling in from the mission in Indonesia. Amin, let's see if we can hear you, and then if so, we can back up to your slides. Okay, maybe not quite yet. We'll give it one more go in just a little bit. So I am now gonna turn it over to Anita van Breda. She is the Senior Director for Environment and Disaster Management at the World Wildlife Fund. Anita leads the fund's work supporting environmentally responsible disaster recovery, restructuring, and risk reduction, including in policy, operations, and training. Anita was instrumental in the World Wildlife Fund's development of the 2010 Green Recovery and Reconstruction Training Toolkit, which some of you may have seen, and manages a natural and nature-based flood management initiative. Anita has worked with a wide range of humanitarian and development agencies, including USAID, on disasters around the world, and serves as co-lead of the Emergency Shelter Cluster Environment Community of Practice. So, Anita, over to you to give us a look on the ground.
Thank you, Joey, and thank you for including WWF in this webinar. In fact, I am on a ground here in Madagascar, just arrived yesterday, so I hope the internet connection holds steady for us here. If it's a little bit wobbly, I'll turn off the video, but it's a pleasure to be with you all. And again, thank you for including us. I'm here to talk about natural and nature-based flood management. If we could go to the next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with World Wildlife Fund, we are a global institution with offices around 100 countries around the world. Our work is primarily organized in these 6 themes, and I'm in the Washington, D.C. office and part of the climate change team. Next slide. So the adaptation and resilience team at WWF, as part of our climate goal, we look at social and ecological resilience really as a interrelated issue between conservation, development, and disaster management. And where those sectors or those fields of work come together is where we can find social ecological resilience and where we work to promote it. Next. But all of that, of course, needs to be adaptive to climate change. So whether we're working in partnerships or on projects or initiatives in these various sectors individually or in an integrated fashion, everything needs to be adaptive to climate change and to the world that we live in now and where we're heading. So for us, next slide, please. Nature-based solutions for climate for WWF is based by and large, our definition is based by and large on the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions. And what you see on the slide here is how we try to break down each part of that definition and be clear and directive about how we're addressing nature-based solutions, from what the solution is, what societal challenge we're trying to address with that solution, how that work supports conservation, and then what are the co-benefits for both people and nature in that work. Next slide. So the team that I manage, the Environment and Disaster Management Program, our work is largely organized into 3 different themes: the green recovery and reconstruction work, which focuses on a multi-hazard approach, not just climate related. We have an infrastructure initiative that focuses primarily on building materials, and then our flood work, which I want to talk about more here today. Next slide. So the work was funded by the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, now the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. And we launched the guidebook in 2015, I believe it was. And the idea behind the guidebook was to have some support for local level decision makers, municipalities, governments around the world, NGOs and CBOs who are looking to start or manage a flood portfolio, flood management, flood risk reduction portfolio, and to provide some guidance on how we can include nature and natural-based approaches as part of that. So the book, it's not a complete how-to, it's not a cookbook, but it does give individuals and teams the basic fundamentals around flood risk management and how to include natural and nature-based methods as part of that process. Next slide. So the book itself covers 29 different methods, and we start with non-structural methods. So that's policy and governance. And if that is insufficient to manage flood risk, then we suggest adding soft or natural and nature-based approaches. And if those 2 ways of managing risk are insufficient, then last and hopefully least, we need to include some hard engineering. And we get a lot of questions about why hard engineering is included in a book that is focused on natural and nature-based approaches. And the reason is because there's a lot of engineering already out in the world. And so we wanted to be mindful of that and realistic. And in some instances, that is the best method and only method to deal with flood risk. But in most places and in most situations, you can use a combination of methods. You can derive multiple benefits from that, as well as some cost savings. Next slide. The Flood Green Guide is based on a 5-step or 5-stage approach, and it's a circular one. And it's pretty common and understandable that most people want to jump right to doing methods to address flood risk. But we really want people to understand what their context is, do proper assessments, and then really be clear about setting a flood management objective. And then looking at the number of different methods that might be appropriate, and looking at selection and design criteria for those combinations of methods, and then make an informed choice about the combination of methods that might work, but also be clear about operation and maintenance and monitoring. There is still investment needed for natural and nature-based approaches for maintenance and operations, so we want to make sure we can include that. And then after evaluating whether the methods work, go back to the beginning, see if anything has changed, update the context, and update the process from there. Next slide. So for each of the 29 methods, we have fact sheets that summarizes in 2 or 3 pages all the different issues and considerations for the different methods. Next. And because there's a lot of different ways to look at different scales, from the watershed to the household level, different combinations of tools and approaches and methods, we've included several matrices within the guidebook to help people, again, do comparisons and make an informed decision about what methods might be appropriate and doable in their space. Next slide. because there's a lot of information, it can get confusing and a little bit of overwhelming. Throughout the guidebook, we have offered worksheets that help the user gather information, organize it, and feel confident about going on to the next stage and taking the next step in addressing the flood risk challenge. Next slide. So we were delighted to get a phase 2 to this program to offer training on how to use the guidebook. Of course, it's pretty tough to solve all flood problems with one guidebook. So we were really happy to have the training program. We spent a number of years developing the curriculum. And then we were about to launch in the beginning of 2020 when we experienced the pandemic. And so like everyone else, we had to pivot to virtual and online only by and large. And we've been implementing that virtual training program ever since. One of the few upsides of the terrible and heartbreaking pandemic has been that we've been able to reach a wider scope in terms of geography and number of people with the training program. And that includes NGOs as well as academic institutions and several different government agencies. Next slide. So we tried to make the virtual training as engaging and fun as possible, including different techniques like serious games and homework assignments and teamwork that people would do in between sessions to try to stay connected and to build their community around natural and nature-based flood management. And we're continuing to do that today as well. Next, please. And it's very difficult to do this kind of work, to actually apply these nature-based approaches on the ground and in the field, so to speak, if we're not learning and if we're not adapting and if we're not bringing back those improved practices and sharing them with each other. So we try to keep the learning going. We try to keep the connection going with all of the participants, with continuing education seminars, bringing in different subject matter experts, hearing from the people who have been through the training and what they've learned and the challenges that they have faced, working with partners and collaborators to have conversations like this and learn from each other. And so we look forward to continuing to do that with all of you, if we may, into the future, and continue to try to address the challenges that we face with flood management, with deriving the benefits that some floods can provide and that are necessary for some ecosystems, while at the same time reducing the risk for people and helping people to adapt to changing conditions, climate and otherwise. Next, please. With that, I thank you for your time. I encourage you to visit our website, grab the resources that are there, or please reach out to us if you would like to discuss any of our flood management work in more detail. And Joey, I'll go back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. Super helpful. Love the practical examples, the ways people can use this specific toolkit, as well as the general thoughts on how nature can be used for disaster risk management. Really excellent. So I am going to try. I think let's see now. I know Amin has called in. Maybe perhaps a better connection. So if we can back up to those slides, and Amin, let's see if we can hear from you now. I mean, if you're talking, you are on mute.
And Joey, it looks like his connection may have dropped. He's no longer here. So
I do see that. Okay, well, that's all right. Maybe actually, I know we had mentioned Noel. I don't suppose you have a quick snapshot about the importance of Indonesia for natural climate solutions work that you want to give, and maybe just a touch on what we're doing there without getting into necessarily the details of the SAGAR program.
I might be able to do that, but I think Jeff Blate is actually better positioned to do that and has indicated he'd be willing to do so.
I don't see Jeff. Oh, there he is. Jeffrey, do we have you?
Well, I have you, but I don't know if you have me.
We do have you. Yeah. So Jeff, it'd be really excellent just to get a little bit of info about Indonesia's importance to climate mitigation efforts, and maybe just a quick snapshot of some of the things we do there without necessarily getting into the nitty gritty of this one program.
So I'm happy to do that. I feel really bad because I know Amin was happy to present and he would be able to give you the best flavor of this. And the other is that I'm joining from our building where Zoom is like a pain in the neck. And so I don't know how well you can hear me, but if you can hear, I'll continue. Joey, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, okay? Okay, great.
I can hear you great.
All right. And Amin, if you rejoin, please just let us know and I will hand over to you. Let me just text him that. And apologies to all for the challenge. I mean, he's calling in from home, so the connection might not be great. It's nighttime in Indonesia, as all of you know. Okay, so SIGAR is the new 5-year activity that the USAID mission in Indonesia is implementing. It stands for Sustainable Environmental Governance Across Regions, and it's really focused on a subnational jurisdictional approach. So you can go to the next slide. And this, I'll linger on this slide for a moment just because I'll let you read it and it gives a decent snapshot of the activity. It's got some pretty high level targets, which I'll come to. And this goes to the point that Joey was just mentioning about why Indonesia is such an important country for us to work in on natural climate solutions. It's a large country with extensive forest and other ecosystems that have extensive stores of carbon. And so what Noel was talking about earlier with respect to manage, restore, and conserve, this is a place that if we can get it right, will contribute a significant amount toward that 11 billion ton target that Noel was talking about. So the aim of the activity is to balance biodiversity conservation and sustainable land use. There's pretty much nowhere in Indonesia where there aren't people, and so we can't just lock people out and tell them not to use the forest or other ecosystem products. So we're really trying to figure out how to manage these areas in a sustainable way. Also, this activity is recognizing that, as Noel was pointing out earlier, a lot of the deforestation and degradation pressures are resulting from production of some kind of commodity, whether it's wood from logging, from trees, oil palm from, palm oil extensification, or some other agricultural commodity. And so it's looking to try to bring in the private sector, as you can see down in the B1 and B2 area, in the bottom of that little circle, to try to make sure that the private companies that are extracting resources or growing agricultural commodities are on board and really working with the subnational jurisdiction, in this case provinces, to agree to zero deforestation commitments, or to just adopting better practices. And this is also being done in conjunction with community members to make sure that the communities are not being left behind. So the objectives are to really strengthen the governance of the governance in these jurisdictions for better management of the agricultural commodity production systems as well as the forests. And then also the second objective is to increase the implementation of environmental and social sustainability goals. So really what what the International Finance Corporation calls environmental, social, and governance standards. It's a 5-year activity, as I said before, about $32 million. And then its big targets are to bring 7 million hectares under improved management, reduce emissions of about 55 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and to mobilize $45 million in investments, both from private sector as well as from other areas. Apologies that I don't have more details than that just now, but hopefully Amin will be able to rejoin, and we can go on to the next slide. Thanks. I think probably what I said already is covered largely in this slide, but you can see in the different little rectangles some of the elements or components or features of this activity. It's really a whole of district approach that they're aiming for, trying to really create a race to the top where different provinces actually become known at that subnational level for really growing products, different agricultural commodities that really not only Indonesia wants, but the world wants, whether it's coffee, chocolate, oil palm, palm oil, all kinds of other products that are traded globally. And so this idea of creating sustainable districts that somehow become known for managing the land in a sustainable way, or at least a low emissions way, that those get developed. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a market element to it by having the private sector be an active partner in this activity. And then developing this kind of shared vision at that subnational level, so everyone feels a sense of shared responsibility. There, as you can see on the left side, there's a collaborating, learning, and adapting element to this whole activity, where it's trying to be nimble and learn as it goes. And then I mentioned also that it's engaging the smallholders, which in many cases for different commodities are the main producers, and their livelihoods are critical to make sure that this activity achieves multiple objectives. And then the last bit there, that it is focused on governance and trying to steer the governance in a direction that will actually achieve those big targets that I mentioned. And apologies if that is just very superficial. I'm sure Amin would give a much better flavor. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just a map of Indonesia that is showing in blue the districts where, so in Indonesia, if you're not familiar, there are provinces across something like 13,000 islands. Those are shown kind of in the white polygons. And then and the gray polygons are the ones where this activity is active. The blue polygons are the ones where SAGAR is actually working, and that is a district level. So this is subnational at the district level. And you can see down in the bottom the different provinces where this activity is active and what the targets from a hectares perspective are. The blue box over on the right gives a summary of that. So in total, there are 12 districts across 4 provinces. These are some of the areas with the largest remaining forest area, and also ones where the mission viewed that or perceived that there was willing and able subnational government institutions that were able to actually really contribute and buy into this activity and the objectives of the activity, not necessarily with money, but they were willing, the governors or the district managers were willing to actually contribute. I won't bother reading all of the targets that are listed there. You can read those for yourselves, just in the interest of time, because there are a lot of questions. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this, I think it might be the last slide or second to last one, but
And yeah,
like
Jeff,
I said
let's
before,
still sorry to interrupt, but let's try I think wrap in the next minute or so on this slide because there's a ton of great questions coming in, and I want to make sure we have ample time for
yep,
them.
yeah, I'll end here. And sorry that went long. So I think this is just a summary. So it is subnational jurisdictional. What's in it for each stakeholder? This summarizes that. So for businesses, businesses these days really do have shareholder interests to keep in mind, and it looks like one of the objectives is to reduce the burden of getting certified by having that kind of subnational level vision and acceptance. And then you can see the smallholders are also having reduced certification costs and inclusivity, and the governments also get some recognition, and they can contribute to different sustainable development goals as well as to their nationally determined contribution elements. So let me pause there. Apologies if that was just way too high level, and over to you, Joey, for questions.
Thanks. No, not at all too high level. That was really excellent, and particularly, I think everyone would agree, very impressive for being more or less on the fly. So thanks so much, Jeff, for that overview. And I'm really sorry. I mean that we couldn't make it work, but obviously great slides, and I'm glad that we could hear a little bit about the work in Indonesia, regardless. So with that, I do want to transition us now to some of the great questions we've been getting. There's a ton that have come through, and if you have one that you have not yet put in, go ahead and click on the Q&A portion of your toolbar and put them in there. So I'm going to start with this first question that we got, which is from Lufsan. USAID has been strong in energy-related mitigation throughout Asia. Does that mean that USAID will be focusing or does this mean we'll be focusing on nature-based solutions under the new strategy? So I guess it's sort of a one or the other question. Are we just doing nature-based solutions? The answer, of course, will be no, we're doing both. Maybe Noel can speak to some of the ways that we're elevating nature-based solutions under the new strategy. And if so, which countries in Asia will you be focusing on? So again, Noel, maybe some of the more critical countries. I think you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but a quick summary would be excellent. Noel?
Happy to. Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I also need to echo your thanks to Jeff. That was amazing. The fluidity of that presentation on the fly with zero preparation. So to Asia, we've had what we use these phrases somewhat interchangeably: sustainable landscapes programs, natural climate solutions programs in Asia for years. We have programs in Indonesia. Vietnam, there's a very strong payment for ecosystem services program in Vietnam. India, what am I forgetting? I know I'm forgetting some here. Let's see, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and I'm still for Cambodia. I still think I'm forgetting one or two. The Philippines and Papua New Guinea. So I don't see that core changing. I think that the difference in the new strategy is that we are asking, that strategy asks every mission and every operating unit in the agency, how can you contribute to these targets, whether or not you have dedicated funding for a particular stream of work. So you could imagine addressing natural climate solutions through other avenues and maybe through governance, maybe through economic development, maybe through food security programming. So I think that's the difference in the new strategy. And as to the energy programming, I can't speak to exactly where that happens.
Great, thank you so much. So let's see, I see another question here. It feels like, some of the work that we were talking about is focused very naturally on biodiverse regions, the Amazon, wetlands, et cetera. How do you see this applying to more severe climates, or how do you integrate this into more developed economies? I think Jenny, as a resident member of the biodiversity division, maybe you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. And I think I remember that question coming in during Noel's presentation. which makes sense because a lot of the NCS portfolio is focused on forests, whether that be sort of rainforest or mangroves as well. But of course, noted throughout the presentation and then in Emily's session, nature-based solutions are applied broadly, not just within those ecosystems. And then particularly in the more sort of severe climes, as the question notes, I want to say that all USAID activities undergo climate risk management. And so that is where we're taking a look at what different risks are posed to programming by different climate stressors and what can we do in response. And so we do that again, all programming, all geographies, ecosystems. And so that's a really good opportunity to bring in the nature-based solutions because you look at risk management options, and many of those risk management options are nature-based solutions. So somewhere, say like the Sahel, that might be more about how do you manage vegetation, or what sort of agricultural practices do you do? Are you employing climate smart agricultural practices? Like all of those are about nature and managing nature and nature-based solutions. So we certainly try to bring in the approaches broadly. And Jeff, do you want to add anything to that on climate risk management?
I think that covered it, but I'm happy to add if people have follow-up questions.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jenny. Okay, so I see another one here. This is for Anita specifically. Curious if the Flood Green Guide considers the implications of sea level rise on coastal communities. Anita?
Yeah, thanks for that. I also put a response in the chat. Yes, we do. And that we really try to address at the first stage, doing a contextual analysis and assessment so that we know what kind of conditions are trying to be addressed and how they're going to change over time. So that's where we really encourage the user of the guidebook to make sure you're connecting with the right climate expertise if you don't have it available in-house or locally to get the best picture that you can. To understand how sea level rise and other things may be impacting the climate and the future changing climate in your place. But we also talk about it in the methods, because even if we're selecting natural and nature-based methods, they themselves are going to be impacted by climate and climate change. And so are they able to adapt and meet the needs of the project as they're being implemented? So several parts along that process, we encourage the user to avail themselves of climate expertise if they don't have it, or include it into the design and the programming in different ways. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move us to another question now. This is from Thora. Why does natural climate solutions only focus on mitigation and not on both adaptation and mitigation at the same time? What are the reasons for USAID to separate these despite many strategic opportunities to combine both? Jenny, I think you might have some thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks for this question, Thora. And we certainly agree that they should be integrated, and that most often you can't even parse them out, especially if you're looking at an ecosystem, say like mangroves. Really, mangroves are amazing. They provide adaptation, mitigation, food security, so many benefits. So I want to name first, before Noel speaks a little bit more specifically to natural climate solutions, that, as everyone knows, USAID funding is appropriated from Congress. And so we have different funding streams that come from that. And so there's funding for biodiversity, there's funding for what we call sustainable landscapes, which is the NCS portfolio. There's funding for adaptation, there's funding for food security. So often we're working with the different budget streams that we get. So some programming naturally flows from each of those, and then we combine. There's a lot of combining, but I think some of that framing is shaped a bit by the funding requirements that we have. That said, we continually integrate different funding streams and programming, whether that's biodiversity with sustainable landscapes, with adaptation, with Feed the Future. So we combine it all because, as you're noting, the objectives are really all linked. And increasingly, we try to capture the different co-benefits that sectors provide using the indicators, right? So if you have, say, an NCS or sustainable landscapes funded only activity, you can certainly have adaptation indicators that are measuring the different adaptation benefits that work is providing as well. And we really hear that from our partners in country, that adaptation mitigation, and we believe that too are inextricably linked. And so we are just doing our programming within the ecosystem that we have, but fully agree with your take on it. And yes, Noel, do you want to add from the NCS perspective?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of points. First, thanks again for the question. It's a great question. It deserves a little bit of time. And on the ground, when we are actually designing, with our field colleagues and trying to support them, when we're actually designing programs, very frequently we are looking at programs that deliver both adaptation benefits, climate change adaptation benefits, and climate change mitigation benefits through nature-based solutions. I think when we zoom out a little bit, it gets a little bit more complicated, and part of that, when we zoom out a little bit, it gets a little bit more complicated. And if we look at the places that most desperately need climate change adaptation, and the places where globally we have to work in order to achieve global targets for natural climate solutions, those are often not exactly the same places. So it's tough for us to look globally and say, we are going to combine our adaptation and sustainable landscapes funding, and we are going to work with those funding streams merged in these 20 or 30 countries. Because when we do that, we start missing the highest priority countries in each place. So there's that first filter of where, in what countries are we going to work. And then there's the filter of within the country, given all of the country context and complexities of how USAID works and funding streams that the mission happens to have, when we actually start designing programs, and this is the reason we do the sustainable landscapes opportunities analyses, and I think and vulnerabilities analyses on the adaptation side, we want to make sure we're not missing the main thing that we need to do in that country. But within that frame, there are almost always ways that we end up achieving both of those benefits, and we try to pay a lot of attention to that in the design and the execution.
Excellent. Thank you both. Really, really interesting answers. Okay, so I see a couple of related questions, which I'm going to sort of group here. So Carrie wrote, how are we dealing with the fundamental economics of adopting natural climate solutions? But I'm going to kind of cheat and broaden this to be both, to broader natural or nature-based solutions, because we're getting a couple finance-related questions. So how are we dealing with the fundamental economics of adopting nature-based solutions as opposed to alternative activities that are competing for the same spaces that tend to be seen as more immediately valuable to politicians and the private sector? So I think first I'm going to pitch this to Anita, and then maybe if anyone else has thoughts, feel free to chime in too. Anita?
Thanks, Joey. This is a really good question and something I think about a lot in our flood management program. And I don't have the answer, but what we try to do is build capacity for those who can do education, outreach, advocacy at multiple levels within society. Because it seems to us from the flood management perspective, it can't be just the green groups and the environmentalists advocating for nature-based approaches to flood management. It has to come from other sectors and other disciplines. So really trying to get integrated communities of practice and partnerships and collaborators to be advocating for that same approach, because we do have to get through certain barriers, certain policy barriers that are in place, funding barriers that are in place to utilize nature-based approaches in flood management. And we can also advocate for some of the co-benefits that we get from nature-based approaches that help reduce the amount of funding that you need for a different kind of approach, and can work in combination and helps to address some of the flexibility that's needed, particularly in flood management, that other more, for us, hard engineering solutions do not provide. So if we can make the case for how we're saving money or how we're programming money, that can help. But there's also certain policy constraints. I've had a few years ago, I tell this story often, I had a mayor from a city in a Mississippi River watershed area call me and say, we're using natural infrastructure. That's what they were calling it for flood management in their area. They had a big flood that overwhelmed that system. They wanted to improve the natural infrastructure, but the money that was being given to them by their governments was really tied to hard engineering. He said, I need help advocating for a different way of managing flood in my place. And the policies and the funding restrictions were not allowing them to do that. So it's just to say that we've got to come at the problem, at least in flood management, from different intervention points, build the capacity for those who need to work at those different intervention points and overcome that challenge that Carrie put forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Excellent thoughts, and really appreciate the practical examples as well. I don't know, Noel or Jenny, if you have any thoughts that you wanted to chime in as well. If not, then there's a few other questions we can get to, but I will pause to see if you guys wanted to add anything.
I put something in the chat that I think builds on Anita's answer, but other than that, happy to go on to other questions.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I did as well. I mean, I think, again, speaking to, say, climate risk management, we, again, can look at risk management options that are nature-based. And so some of these different resources, whether we're doing cost-benefit analysis of different intervention types or looking at the evidence on nature-based solutions, or in this case, the summary is on ecosystem-based adaptation, can really speak to when nature-based solutions are sort of the better evaluation to do. Excellent.
Thank you so much. Okay, I see another one here, and this is going to relate a little bit. I'll read it first. This is from Schaefer. And Noel, I think I'm going to come to you with this one, so heads up. Can the speakers discuss the differences between direct implementation and systems approaches in the context of climate smart agriculture? And you know, this is interesting, and I'll note that, you know, last month we did do a webinar on climate smart agriculture and how it relates to USAID's climate strategy. So I would encourage you, Schaefer, to take a look at that. And I'll go ahead and pop a link in the chat to that webinar. And it had a good Q&A session on some of this as well, with both USAID folks as well as some of our external colleagues. But Noel, I know this is an area you work on, so maybe I'll see if you have some thoughts on climate smart ag and systems approaches.
I think I can offer something on that. Yeah, let me start with an intervention in climate smart agriculture that I wouldn't consider to be a systems approach, and that might be promoting a drought-resistant variety of a particular crop, you know, that can continue to produce in the face of hotter, drier conditions. And we could come up with lots of examples like that. More efficient fertilizer management, for example. Maybe if, you know, there are a number of folks working on feed additives for cattle that are intended to reduce methane emissions in burps and you know, from the cows. So that would be an example of a practice that I wouldn't consider a systems level change. When you think about the food and agriculture system, it is huge. You know, it includes what we eat. It includes the people, you know, the men and the women who harvest the food, who cook the food. It includes the transportation systems that bring food and agricultural products from the field to a processor, to a retailer, to a consumer. It includes the production of charcoal in rural areas that is the primary cooking fuel in urban areas in sub-Saharan Africa. It includes the amount of food that is lost and wasted between the field, you know, and wherever it ends up, you know, in the landfill or in a street. So if we think about how are you going to address the agriculture food system, and some people talk about food systems because it's so big, that's a very different question. You know, so it might involve a number of different interventions, and some of them might be campaigns to shift preferences for cooking fuels in urban areas. It might involve thinking about how can we shift agricultural subsidies so that they discourage the incursion on forest land through agricultural expansion. It might include trying to support insect-based farming in peri-urban areas to shift dietary trajectories so that 20 years from now, in certain places, we're eating more poultry or more insect-based foods and less ruminant-based foods, which are such a large source of emissions. So to me, you know, you can think about exactly how we are going to address systems change in agriculture as an agency is something we're just starting to wrestle with, I think. Tomorrow, there is a meeting of the Board on International Food and Agriculture Development. It's a public meeting to elicit input on exactly that question, and BIFAD then advises USAID. So that's the way I think about the difference between practices and systems with respect to climate smart agriculture. And one of the things that the agency is doing right now to try to address that a little bit more head on in the context both of the climate strategy and in the context of the global food security strategy.
Thanks, Noel. Really excellent thoughts. So, I mean, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. So I'm gonna put this one out there. Just leave it open for our panel. Any best practices or examples on how nature-based solutions have been applied in fragile or conflict-affected areas? So while you guys think on that, I'm just going to note, there's a ton of questions I realize that we didn't get to. Always works out that way. If you feel like you still have outstanding questions that we didn't answer, do shoot us a note. We'll put an email in the chat. You can email us. It's either climatestrategy@USAID, or you can email the Climate Links team directly, and we'll put those in the chat in just a second. Or we'll put them right on screen. Thank you, Sophie. So you can see there. Go ahead and shoot us an email if you have outstanding questions. We'll make sure to get back to you. And again, thanks everyone so much for coming today. It's been, I think, a really enlightening discussion. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to come back to our question about applying nature-based solutions in fragile or conflict-affected areas. And I'm just going to leave this one open. Noel, Jenny, Anita, Emily, any thoughts, any experience in that area?
Applying nature-based solutions in conflict areas. Is that am I getting that right?
Yeah, conflict or fragile.
We certainly have experience doing that in post-conflict areas. Colombia would be a great example, where the conflict is, I don't know if it's fair to say that it's ended, but it's certainly not the same as it was a decade ago. And a lot of our natural climate solutions programming in Colombia, and we have a very large program there, is structured because of that post-conflict environment. The mission works particularly in zones that the government has designated in particular ways because of that conflict. I think for places that are currently in conflict, the person that I'd look to is Daniel Abrahams, who I don't know if is on this call right now. But if there's somebody who has particular.
Yeah, and if Daniel's not here, he could definitely speak much more eloquently to this example in Uganda. I posted in the chat a link to a case study on climate risk management, which is, whether we call it a nature-based solution or not, this is an area with a lot of conflict, a lot of pastoralists, with resource scarcity, exacerbating the conflict. And so the activity looked at how to really end the conflict or reduce it by bringing together people to look at how they can address the resource scarcity together. And so just have a look at that case study that I posted in the chat. Over to Anita.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add that a lot of places where we've worked are either in conflict, coming out of conflict, or heading into conflict. So there's can be very little separation between all those different phases. And I would just encourage all of us to take advantage of the folks that we work with internationally and in country who have expertise in that area, and bring them in to the process, bring them into the design of your work, or no matter where you are in your work, to get that kind of input and guidance. It can be very helpful.
Thanks, all. Some great thoughts there. And I also want to acknowledge a comment in the chat from Diane Russell. Some nature-based solutions, there are some nature-based solutions in the Eastern DRC to reduce charcoal use, which causes conflict. Another great example. So I'm going to wrap there. Thanks again to our panel so much. I'm also going to call out a comment in the chat that Noel did put theories of change in the chat. And so take a look at that. We'll also make sure to link those. Climate Links, we'll post sort of a wrap up of this webinar. We'll make sure to link to that resource, as well as the others that we put in the chat throughout. throughout the time here. So thanks again, everyone, so much for tuning in. Thanks to our panel for great presentations and your thoughts during this discussion session. And I'm going to pass it back to Meredith, who has been helping facilitate on the side, just for some wrap-up points. Meredith?
Terrific. Well, just let me add my thanks as well to all of our panelists, to all of you who have attended and stayed with us today. We very much appreciate it. As you log out today, a survey will pop up once you hit the leave button. And so we ask if you could just take 2 minutes of your time to respond to that 3-question survey. Your inputs will help to ensure that future webinars are targeted towards the things that you all care the most about. And again, we just want to really appreciate your participation. As Joey shared, there's lots of ways to get in touch, so please go to Climate Links to see all the follow-up from this session. In fact, the video will be available immediately. Resources, blog posts, and PowerPoints are coming soon. If you have follow-up questions, please use that climate strategy at USAID address, and the folks online, many of them here, as well as their colleagues as well, will be happy to respond. And so again, want to thank you so much. We'll be closing the webinar momentarily. And again, just want to really appreciate your participation, being part of the Climate Links community. We're delighted to have been able to offer this and really look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you all.